Our next video on the slavery topic is looking at freedom and freedmen, or former slaves. So the key questions you need to answer are: number 1, how could a slave earn his or her freedom? Number 2, what does manumission mean and what forms could it take? Number 3, what advantages were there to freeing a slave? And number 4, what was the status of a freedman and how did this change over time? So in terms of ending their time as a slave and becoming a freedman, a slave could do this in one of 4 ways. So the first way was to save up money from the work they did. They might get a bit of pocket money from their master and buy their freedom, which was sort of the price of a replacement slave. The second way was being set free in their master's will. The third way was as a reward for loyal service. And the fourth way was running away, provided they didn't get caught. So the term for freeing a slave is manumission, and there are a few different ways that this could take place. It could, for example, be the master informally saying in front of about 5 people that he's setting the slave free. He could also take his slave along to be enrolled as a citizen on the census roll, and this was known as manumission facts. The making a statement in his will is known as manumission testamento. They could make a legal agreement which is witnessed by a magistrate, but the usual form is what's known as manumission vindicta, and we'll go through what that looked like. So here's an image of what the ceremony would have looked like. So the master would have brought his slave before a magistrate and said why he wanted to set him free. And the lictor, or sort of bodyguard of the magistrate, we can see him here, he's sort of the middle of those 3 figures in togas, put a rod onto the slave who was wearing a felt cap which showed that he was free, and said in Latin, vindicavit in libertatem, which means I release him into freedom. The master would hold the slave and say, hunc hominem liberum volo, so I want this man to be free, and then he would turn him around and set him free, and the magistrate would declare that he was a freedman. So the slave was now known as a freedman. So they were Roman citizens, but they had limited rights, and it wasn't until they had freeborn children of their own that they possessed full citizen rights. And the master-slave relationship would develop into a patron-client relationship, that sort of mutually beneficial relationship where the patron looked after a poorer client and the client sort of worked or gave them political support in return. They would keep a connection through the names. So the Romans had 3 names and the former slave would adopt 2 and then keep his slave's name. So there would still be this very visible connection between them. So he may have run a small business, often related to what he did as a slave, and sometimes they earned a lot of money, but sometimes they remained quite poor. And quite often female slaves would end up marrying their masters. So because Roman citizens couldn't marry slaves, if you fell in love with a female slave, you'd have to set her free first. There were also benefits for the master. So if you set a slave free, you gained a client, and so they could perform various jobs for you and support you politically. And if the slave paid for their freedom, then you would get the money to pay for a new slave. And so Cicero, a Roman lawyer, reckoned that it would take a slave about 6 years of good work to earn enough money to free himself. Just a few facts and figures about manumission. So the Romans didn't want too many slaves getting free because if there was a large number of new citizens, this could create political instability. So they didn't really have the same kind of loyalty and background as Roman citizens. And they could also be politically motivated. So if you wanted to gain a whole lot of bodyguards and soldiers, you could free lots and lots of slaves because they'd be very loyal to you. So because of this, there were a few laws created to get around this. So for example, the Lex Aelia Sentia in 3 AD meant that a slave could only be freed once he was 30 and had a good character, and a master had to be at least 20 to set him free. And this other one, the Lex Fufia Caninia, it sort of limited how many slaves you could set free at one time. The sort of role and position of freedmen did change over time under the Roman Empire. They ended up having a lot more influence and power. So they gained lots of opportunities. So rather than kind of being poor shopkeepers or labourers, they could join the middle class, known as the equestrians, in the Senate or the government. They could become governors of provinces, so areas further away from Rome. And they could work in the imperial household, which gave them effectively a role in government. So there were so many freedmen at Rome that it's estimated that by the 1st century AD, so a bit after we're studying, at least around 90% of Romans had at least one freedman as an ancestor, so that is a huge amount. Okay, just double check you've got the answers to the key questions. So how a slave could earn their freedom, what manumission means and what forms it could take, the advantages to freeing a slave, and the status of a freedman and how it changed over time. If you have any questions or problems, let me know and we can discuss them in class.